It turns out that our speaker for tonight's program was also a student of Professor James Applewhite, and he too has some things to say about Jim within his presentation to us. So before we let Jim have a few minutes to speak at the end of the program, first we're going to hear tonight's talk from Timothy B. Tyson, Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University and Visiting Professor of American Christianity and Southern Culture at Duke Divinity School. Tim is the author of Radio Free Dixie, Robert F. Williams and the Roots of Black Power, which provided the basis for a documentary film. He co-edited with David Cicelsky, Democracy Betrayed, the Wilmington Race Riot of 1898 and its Legacy. And he is perhaps best known for his award-winning book, Blood Done Sign My Name, which was made into a feature film that reflects, I believe, what Paul Green saw of the potential of movies. Lost Colony author Green was another North Carolinian who fought for civil rights through his writing and through the name recognition he had earned from his writing. Green expressed his concern with movie makers who dumb down films to an audience they do not apparently respect. But Green had faith in writers putting their art above money-making. His prophecy on this subject comes true in the film adaptation of Blood Done Sign My Name that Tim Tyson worked on with director Jeb Stewart. Quoting Green, "The hundreds of dissatisfied creative minds whose sole job day after day is the making of money for bankers, millionaires, and stockholders will someday break into open revolt. There is no price large enough to keep a rebellious spirit indefinitely enslaved." Green anticipated that such writers as Tim Tyson would, quote, create pure forms of cinematic art, and when this new art has broken itself loose from the industry and professionalism of Hollywood, he said, we shall see moving picture dramas worthy of the name. Writers, actors, directors, and musicians will then take joy and pride in their work and will strive to the best of their minds and souls to deal with the camera as its essential nature provides. And what they create will be of their own making, and the writers will be free to write scenarios as full of imagination and poetry as their gifts will allow. End quote. So now I invite Tim up here to talk to us about watching his book, Blood Done Sign My Name, turned into an independent film that would make Paul Green proud. And while he's making his way up here, I'd like to ask his father, Reverend Vernon Tyson, to wave or stand up at my students over there in the corner. We've been reading the memoir, and I told them that you were coming. They want to know who you are. So, Tim Tyson.
Thank you, Margaret. My people don't really go to cocktail parties much. We might meet you around behind the church cemetery for, with just a pint of clean, clear branch water and await the Jesus to turn it into something more bracing. Or we might meet you at the altar for a nip of Welch's grape juice. But not cocktail parties so much. But some years ago, my daddy, Reverend Vernon Tyson, found himself at a cocktail party, a fancy one in Manhattan, no less. There he was, a Methodist among the martinis, looking for someone to talk to, and he overheard what seemed like a really unlikely conversation about tobacco farming, which may not be a routine subject in Manhattan. At least he was surprised to hear about it. And so he sort of sidled up to the conversation and asked if that indeed was what they were talking about. And he said, well, they said, well, really, we're actually talking about tobacco farming in eastern North Carolina. And he said, well, I was a tobacco farmer in eastern North Carolina. And then they said, well, actually, we were talking about, sharecropping tobacco on the Applewhite farm in Wilson County. And he said, well, I was a sharecropper on the Applewhite in eastern North Carolina, in Wilson County. And his hostess did not believe him, but she said, really, actually, we were talking about an article in the New Yorker, the truth, by V.S. Naipaw about the Applewhite farm in eastern North Carolina. Daddy said, who's V.S. Naipaw? I don't remember him, but I can tell you all about Henry Applewhite. And so he had a real good time at the cocktail party in Manhattan, though he drank water like the Methodist preacher he is. We just do it, in our family, we don't only do it one way or the other. We are teetotaling preachers, or we're up in the Pocosin making liquor. I want to thank everybody whose labors went into bringing us home and for having this time together. Margaret and Blythe and Dan and Alice Oliver and all of those who have fed us and welcomed us and put us up. We really appreciate it. And for us, it really is homecoming because the Tysons came to the Applewhite farm in 1942 when Jack Tyson, my grandfather, brought his family there. He was deeply in debt, had a whole house full of children, handsome string bean of a man with a brilliant intellect. We called him Jack. He was born in 1901 near Friendship Baptist Church in Greene County. Oldest of 7 children, Willie and Patty Mae. Willie broke his leg one spring when Jack was in the 8th grade, and so he offered to quit school and sharecrop tobacco, and so he did, and that's what he did until he got to the Applewhite farm. They were Free Will Baptists. He and his Uncle Alonzo, his church, Uncle Alonzo decided that actually, if you read the scripture, the Sabbath is supposed to be on Saturday. Not a lot of people think this. Of course, it doesn't matter a bit, but he was rather literal in his interpretations of things, and that was his reading of it. And so they're still out there and meet on Saturday, actually. Anyway, he and Alonzo would farm side by side. They never tired of talking about theology and the things of God and the way things work. Early one morning, Jack was needing to set the sweep on the plow, and so he went over to Alonzo's place to borrow a wrench, and Alonzo met him halfway across the field, and they began talking about things of the Spirit, and then they heard the lunch bell ringing. They'd been out there the whole morning, standing in the field, talking about the things of the Spirit, and it's no wonder they stayed poor. Now, the Free Will Baptists displayed a lot more emotion than the Methodists did, or certainly the Presbyterians. They called them foot washing Baptists, and in fact, the Free Willers held quarterly meetings at which they did wash one another's feet with a tin basin and clean towels. Jesus washed feet, and that was good enough for them. And they would file up row by row at the end of the service and tenderly, carefully kneel before each other with the basins and the towels in this quiet drama of humility and kindness, a sacrament that underlined the fact that Jesus had called his followers to lives of humble service. Now, men washed the feet of men, and women washed the feet of women. There was a clear understanding that a young man washing a young woman's feet, or vice versa, was unlikely to keep his mind on the things of the Spirit. My grandfather was a fundamentalist. He would join the Klan when he was a young man. He was ignorant, but he had a strong mind and an independent spirit. And after a few months, he quit the Klan because he found out they were knotheads. And he read voraciously. He went back to high school when he was 30 and had 10 children, and went up to Campbell Institute and got some kind of certificate. He was a renowned preacher. He was famous in these parts as an evangelist and had more preaching invitations than he could accept by a long shot. Now, he grew up in a world where preachers didn't prepare sermons much. The Free Will Baptist thought you just open your mouth and let the Lord fill it, which he did not think the Lord was responsible for all the things coming out of the mouths around him. And he called that beat the book and holler. But his reading and his writing and his careful preparation and scholarship, mixed with that fire and passion that he had all along, had turned him into a powerful vehicle for his vision and the best vision of his people. It also encouraged him, education encouraged him to break the shackles of fundamentalism. He began to say, the Bible's not a history book. It's not a biology book. It's the highest we know of God, but we don't know everything about God. Not everything about God's in the Bible. And we're not going to understand God. If God was small enough for us to understand, He wouldn't be big enough for us to worship. This is God. God is big. You don't think you know. He didn't need a divine blueprint. He didn't. The fundamentalists had a tendency to want to know everything and to claim to know everything. And maybe you don't, but they did. But Jack that moved away from that. And he starts out in the Klan and ends up a couple of decades later sort of about to skate off the left end of the New Deal. He became real good friends with Keith Taylor, who was a populist Methodist preacher, and treated colored people just like they were white, and went up to the mill when the mill workers were striking and stood with the mill workers. So Henry Applewhite is a big piece of this because he was Jack's teacher and friend. When Jack was way down in debt, when he got to the Applewhite farm out there on the mile from Stantonsburg, sharecropping was a means of oppression. It was racial, but not just racial. It was deeper for black sharecroppers and different. But in every case, they had a spigot with your income, and there was nothing you could do. And you didn't, to pull a pencil, as one of the furnishing merchants said to him once. One of your boys came in here, Jack, pulled a pencil on me. Pulled a pencil. You didn't add up your bill. They told you how much you owed. And lots and lots of people, lots and lots of years didn't make anything. And Jack came, but Henry Applewhite didn't cheat. And so Jack actually made money at the Applewhite farm and paid his way out of all his debt for the first time in his adult life. He also became a Methodist because of Henry Applewhite. And he left the Applewhite farm to take a church at Dover, 5 Methodist churches on the Dover circuit out between Kinston and Newburgh. A whole new life, as our friend Reynolds Price might say. Henry Applewhite owned the house out there in the farm, but he had a house in town. And the house says, we go out there, it's on the regular sort of graveyard tour that my father and I do pretty often, a couple times a year. We'll ride out, and we don't always go to the same place, but this is a regular, the spreading oak's still there, the deep roots both above and below the soil, 2 brick chimneys, two broad porches, not just a widow's walk on the second floor, but actually a real broad porch, and one downstairs too. And the one upstairs, Daddy would sleep when he was a boy on hot summer nights when the mosquitoes weren't too bad. Solid peg construction. A mile from Stannisburg, a mile from Contentney Creek, where they would swim. Henry Applewhite lived in town, but he walked out every morning and got the Tysons had a milk cow, and Mr. Applewhite would come out just to get a quart of milk. He would walk a mile from town, and then he would walk out across his fields in a kind of a sacramental way. He appreciated and venerated the seasonal and the specific and the local and the perfect gifts of God. Thoreau has this passage I really like. He talks in the first part of Walden. He talks about when before he got to Walden Pond, he thought of buying a farm, and so he went out and toured a lot of farms. And he said he would walk across the farm and eat the apples and drink the milk and meet the folks, and then he left realizing that he had really skimmed the cream, that he had already taken the best part of the farm. And he felt like he was cheating a little bit. After he toured a few farms, he realized he wasn't buying any farm. He had already got it, And Mr. Applewhite came and, I think, skimmed the cream off his own farm. It was different because he already owned it, of course. But he would come out and get himself a quart of milk and the things that reminded him of his past, and then he would go back into town. Now, our family got there in World War II, and Mr. Applewhite told my granddaddy about coming in to breakfast one morning, and Mrs. Applewhite was sitting there, and it was World War II, and they had sugar rations. And he sat down and he saw that there were 2 sugar bowls, a new one, the old sugar bowl, but a new one. And she said, "Now, Henry, this is your sugar bowl. You use a lot of sugar. And, sugar's rationed, so, that's your sugar. This is my sugar. And you can use it at whatever rate you want to, but this is my sugar." It wasn't easy. But Mr. Applewhite's made Jack a Methodist, not with sermons, but with the language of his life, the way he walked in the world, not in a hurry, with generosity, some regard for the other fellow. He also had a pretty good preacher named Wade Golston in Stannisburg, and between him and Reverend Golston, they talked Jack was in a denominational fight. Of course, he was a Free Will Baptist, so it may be redundant to say that he was in a denominational fight, but he wanted the Free Will Baptists to build a seminary. Now, they've done it now, of course, many, many, many years later, but he lost. They weren't going to build. They thought book learning, they were very suspicious of. It just ruined good. You lost good religion with all that book learning. And he had wanted his children to grow up with some education. And if the Free Will Baptists weren't interested in education, then, so to speak, to hell with them. And of course, and Mr. Applewhite was right there, so I'd say, they were really a Methodist all along. Now, our family's religious journey may seem to ratify the whole joke that a Methodist is just a Baptist that's learned to read and write. But that's not nice, and I wouldn't say that. The Baptists resented it. They said Jack had sold out for filthy lucre, and the Methodists had won him over by promise to send his children to college, which was not true in any literal way. However, in fact, all 6 of his sons became Methodist preachers, and most of them went to Duke Divinity School, and Mr. Duke picked up most of the tab. And is still paying me, now that I think of it. He's been a lovely man ever since he died. The Methodists did have an educated clergy, and that brought a lot of light down here, you know. I mean, that was a whole lot of learning getting sprinkled around. It may not have been all the best learning, but it was better learning than there was down at the branch head, and I think it made a big difference. And I do appreciate Mr. Duke. For me, it's the Methodists are sort of a middle-class denomination too. So my life was really different. I mean, the Free Will Baptists, they didn't have a retirement plan. I mean, that was no more your job than, painting pictures or changing tires. I mean, it's just things that people do. But you preach on Sunday, and however you made a living, it wasn't necessarily connected to being a Free Will Baptist preacher. I mean, you've got a lot of pecans and sweet potatoes, and some pay, but it's not the same line of work really as a church with it. Where you have a job. If a Free Will Baptist fire if you meet another Free Will Baptist church out there somewhere, they hire you, okie dokie. But you're on your own. There you go. So, I grew up with carpet on the floor, and a picture on the wall, and I had piano lessons. I didn't do too well, but I did, in a house full of books. And that was really Henry Applewhite's work in a lot of ways. They lived in a world that was poor, a world that had been crushed and defeated, a world that was scarred by a deep sin around race, tobacco, and the fact of death. James Applewhite writes, tobacco was a mystery and a paradox. For me, it had a certain resonance, this whole tobacco business, and it's close to the paradox of civilization itself, that this essentially poisonous substance formed the basis of a way of life that had so many attractive aspects, a formalized seasonal cycle which left the land combed into even furrows after the stalks were cut in the autumn, which had the spectacle of the tobacco market with its golden piles of aromatic leaf sold for what were really considerable sums of money. Tobacco was a past way of life, a kind of traditional, conservative, fallen world marked by original sin, of which tobacco was a symbol. Jim uses the term folk art for tobacco because tobacco was a handmade thing. It took a craft. You couldn't just show up to work. There was an art to every piece of it. And if you did it wrong, it would mess things up. And if you did it right, you got the bright leaf that was the whole idea. But of course, tobacco was a useless thing. You don't need it to live. Now, I have needed it to live, as many of us have. It's just kind of a curious thing. It's also poisonous and addictive. I mean, it both creates business and dispenses with it. You're creating customers and putting it into them too, but that's just kind of the contradiction of tobacco. Jim has a poem where he's talking about slaughtering hogs, which you do on a cold morning. And so the heat from the fire and the water and the blood, he says their blood steamed like ghosts in the cold. One has this romanticism, but when one goes and looks at it, it's not a fiction. It does exist. It's a quarter of a mile away from the farmhouse of my grandfather's, where there's a graveyard, and there my grandfather's parents are buried with some other people, Jim writes. And that's, so there is the fact of it in that way. His poem about Henry Applewhite This is just a passage. Above the land to face the dying of Henry Applewhite, whose name was on the central store, he owned no more. He was venerated, generous, a tyrant to his family. With his ally, the God of Moses and lightning, who kept the old way in changing times, who killed himself plowing in his garden, toiling in the sacrament of seasons. That was the rhythm and the beauty of the life and the deep contradictions of it as well. There were millions of dollars that changed hands on those spit-stained pine floors in Wilson and Oxford and Durham. There was the sing-song chanted auctioneer with its own, everyone with his own sort of unique style of doing that. And the blues in Mississippi sounds a certain, Robert Johnson, you've got a howling and desolate sound. But the blues in the Piedmont is party music. And you can hear Chuck Berry coming if you listen to it right in Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, and the whooping style that comes out of black preaching, and that comes out of this world of labor too that's shared. And the blues of the Piedmont is that way because there were people walking around with rolls of money in their pocket. Now, white people had most of the money, but they were giving it away to people that played and buying pies. I guess it would be my great uncle who went up and they asked at the end of dinner if he wanted a piece of pie for he and his boy. And he said, "No, bring us a whole one." And they ate several pies. And I think about that. I was over at the Cumnock Methodist Church, and Miss Eleanor Burns came up to me. She can't see too well. She can't see at all now, but she couldn't see too well. She was in her late 90s, and she came up and she thanked me so warmly how much it meant to her, whatever it was. And she said he had this for me, and she wanted me to have it. And David Zaselsky was with me, and we went out to by the way, you've got to read his new book on Abraham Galloway. It's just, that's so good. But David and I went to the car, and then I opened the bag, and it was sweet potato pies, 2 of them. And I just busted one of them in half and handed him a half, and we had a half. And we started riding down the road, and of course, we ate both pies. But that's just the way we do things. But this sense of excess and playfulness and is there. We don't eat, just milk toast either. We eat red pepper and vinegar, please, and hickory wood, smoked in greasy pits beside the barns. And it was all about the work. It's about hogs and tobacco. It's about black and white. It's about what do you do at the end of it all? And is there a moment? E.R. Mitchell has a mural in his old restaurant before the white people put him in jail. In his old restaurant in Wilson, and it's a mural that starts with Indians and white people and Africans, and it goes through the whole process of hogs and tobacco along this big room in this ball, and at the end there's this banquet that's kind of ethereal, and the tables are, the sawhorses are laden with pies and hams, and bowing down with the weight of the plenty, and there's a moment when none of it, he explains, there's a moment when it doesn't matter about that, when we're all children of God together. But tobacco was like that, the culture of tobacco, deeply flawed, and yet a beautiful and generous thing. Tobacco put food on our tables, and steeples on our churches, and stains on our fingers, and spots on our lungs, and contradictions in our hearts that it takes a poet to untangle. And that's, as they say, nice work if you can get it. And I'm so glad that Jim Applewhite has got it. He was my teacher. In some ways, I guess, his granddaddy was my granddaddy's landlord, and then he was my landlord. I thought V.S. Naipaul got him pretty good. He described him, he says, he spoke from the heart, without affectation, with a farmer's matter-of-factness, and an academic carefulness, and the poetry that walked the fields with love, as his grandfather had, when he came out to the old home place for his walk. He introduced me to my favorite book, All the King's Men, which I've read 15 or 20 times since then. I still remember the arguments in class. I won't. I could, but I won't. Stupid son of it. This fool. We're talking about Huey Long. We're talking about Willie Stark. We're talking about the poor and downtrodden who are being ground beneath the feet of these aristocrats, and what to do about it. And it's complicated. It's a serious moral issue. What's the meaning of doing what has to be done in that situation? Because they've got all the guns and all the money. If it would, and this moron in our class kept saying, well, he thought when we were talking about the moral issues in All the King's Men, like, which is slavery, selling a woman away into prostitution in New Orleans, etc., etc. We're talking about the moral issues in All the King's Men, and all he could think about is adultery. Willie Stark was sleeping with a woman who wasn't his wife. That's the moral issue? I mean, that wasn't nice, but that wasn't even close. But anyway, he endured these both, my bad temper and other people's idiocy, and mine too. I want to share one more moment that we had, because Henry Applewhite is this symbol and this real person of great virtue, whose virtue I know, from his impact on our family. And he's the kind of a symbol of a defeated South that is wiser in its brokenness, that has lost, that's also, it has a nobility that is not ruthless enough to win in the modern world. And he is a kind of a keeper of the rhythms and the flavor and the shape of the old world. He's a kind of Atticus. Andy Griffith is sort of a cartoonish version, but you know what I'm saying. And that was true. But then I was up in the Library of Congress, and I was reading the NAACP papers, and I came across a document, and it was the NAACP. They'd sent Herbert Hill down here because there was a landlord in Wilson County who found out that his tenants were, his black tenants were trying to register to vote, and put them off the land. And when I looked at the name, it was Henry Applewhite. And I went outside and bummed a cigarette. And I didn't quite know what to do about that. I mean, I held the paper like, I made a copy of it, and I held it like it was a dead snake. I put it in the box. Then I brought it back, and I didn't know whether to show it to Dr. Applewhite. Because I thought, but I gave it to him, and he took it, and he read it, and he took it with a real sadness, and I felt kind of ashamed. But then I understood by his way, and I don't remember the words exactly, that this was our job, and then he showed me how to do it. You take the evil and the deep flaw, and then you fold it into the mix, You don't throw it all away just to be rid of the shame, And you don't deny the wrong. You don't deny anything. It's all part of it. And then the work of culture is learning what to keep and what to let go. Learning the heart of the matter, what to hold on to, what to pass on to your children. But learning to turn pain and sorrow and wrong into an ordered art and a lyrical expression of the essence of things that can look in a blues inflected kind of way, can look it in the eye and see both the hard, thorny part, but that sees the fruit of it and what has to be passed on in these words. I know this is a kind of a long thank you, but but I owe more than I can pay. Like a many sharecropper's son before me, I owe the landlord more than I can pay. But in his case, he don't keep no ledger book, but instead just taught me what to do with it. And for that, I am very, very grateful.